Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maya Ghosh, and I am one of your Ath Fellows for the year. Regardless of their chosen discipline, CMC students across the academic spectrum are impacted by the legacy of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman. Both figures were staunch supporters of American capitalism who yielded different answers to questions regarding the ethics of this particular economic system. Tonight, our speaker, Jennifer Burns, will draw on original research to explore the ideas and lives of these two American icons. Jennifer Burns is an associate professor of history at Stanford University, where she teaches courses on American political, cultural, and intellectual history. She's also a research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. Burns is the author of Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right, an intellectual biography of the controversial novelist and philosopher. Based on exclusive access to Rand's personal papers, Goddess of the Market is the only book to draw upon Rand's unedited letters and journals. It was released to great critical acclaim by numerous publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, The Economist, amongst so many more. She is also a popular guest on radio and television programs, having been interviewed on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, The Colbert Report, C-SPAN's Book TV, NPR's Weekend America, and Here and Now. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Harvard Magazine, Foreign Policy, the Christian Science Monitor, amongst numerous academic journals. Finally, she is currently in the midst of completing her next book, an intellectual biography of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, relying upon his papers housed at the Hoover Institution. As one of CMC's 75th anniversary distinguished speakers, Professor Burns will highlight issues in civilization and commerce, one of the three academic collaboration themes of our special 75th anniversary celebration. Her lecture tonight is also co-sponsored by the Salvatore Center of CMC. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We ask that you take a moment to put on your masks, make sure you keep them on for the duration of the program indoors. And we also ask that you take a moment to just put away your cell phones, take a deep breath, and remember to be present right here, right now. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Burns to the Athenaeum.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm delighted to be part of Claremont's 75th anniversary celebration, and I'm especially pleased to join the series on civilization and commerce. CMC's motto, I learned, is civilization prospers with commerce. Yet today, as the lecture organizers noted to me, there are new questions about the relationship between free exchange and our democratic republic. Questions about economic inequality, environmental degradation, negative impacts of free trade and globalization from job losses, questions about a global pandemic. As one economist put it recently on his blog, quote, "Even my business school students have doubts about capitalism." So while some of the questions that we may be asking today are new, this is actually a perennial tension between civilization and commerce. So I'm an intellectual historian. I like to think about ideas in their context, how ideas are shaped by their historical moment, and in turn shape their historical moment. So I'm going to kind of walk you through an intellectual history of some of these tensions between commerce and civilization. And I'm going to take a biographical approach to talk about the sort of ethics of capitalism through the work of some seminal thinkers, to talk about various ways capitalism has been understood and justified. What I find is that the heart of the problem often comes down to inequality. There's a fear that capitalism itself creates inequality, and that inequality itself is bad for societies, for civilization. So if civilization can prosper with commerce, if we have too much commerce, perhaps civilization itself comes under strain or under threat. So this is, like I said, not a new dilemma, and there's many thinkers who've tried to work their way through it. And I'm going to take the biographical approach, as I said, looking at Ayn Rand, the subject of my first book. And actually, I came to the Athenaeum first about 10 years ago to talk about this book, so it's really nice to be back. And then I'm also going to talk about the economist Milton Friedman, the subject of the book I'm writing. But I want to start with another figure, a lesser-known figure, who is going to help us set up this question. Can there be an ethics of capitalism? And if so, what would that look like? How can we reconcile commerce and civilization? Okay, so I'm going to start with another economist from the University of Chicago, the economist Frank Knight, and a bit of an eccentric guy, as you can see. So Knight is best known for his 1921 book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And I'm going to put a plug in here for you econ majors or just those who are generally interested in the topic to check out this book. It's different than your typical economics book. I will admit, written almost a century ago, more than a century ago, it has really long sentences and big words, but I'm going to tell you that's good for your brain. That's like mental exercise. We all need practice and focused attention these days. So this is a book about economics, but Knight in his day was also known as the sort of foremost opponent of socialism, both in the broader world and within the discipline of economics itself. So we're going to find that while he's talking about things like risk and uncertainty and economic ideas, there's also within the text a justification for capitalism. Okay, so I'm just going to go kind of high-level summary of what Knight ends up talking about in this book. So what's really fundamental to his argument is a distinction between risk, which is something that can be measured, and uncertainty, which is something that cannot be measured. So risk is something you could not only measure, but you could price it. So we can think of insurance as the price of risk. You can think of an actuarial table that says, how long are you going to live based on your demographic characteristics? Or an analysis of traffic fatalities on a particular road that can give you your risk of driving on that road. Right, so it's something you can manage, you can measure, you can know. Whereas uncertainty is like the existential problem of life, right? Things that happen that you didn't foresee, that you can't predict, that are nonetheless consequential. So he's talking about 1921, he calls this uncertainty. In 2022, we call this a black swan. So something that happens that's unanticipated and unknown. And like I said, this book still pays rereading. You might hear, if you ever hear Knightian risk or Knightian uncertainty, this is referring back to Knight's work. So what does all this have to do with capitalism, or with the third word in the title, profit? So what Knight ends up arguing is that it is the ability to act in the face of uncertainty that creates profit. So the social role of the entrepreneur or the business owner is to look at a situation where you can't measure it, you can't price it, you can't know for sure what's going to happen, and to go ahead and act anyways. And that creates the opportunity for profit. But more critically, it also creates, in Knight's reading, the justification for profit. Because you need that profit as a reward to motivate the difficulty of action in the face of uncertainty, right? Uncertainty can create paralysis. If you act anyhow, if you take a risk, it's right that you have a reward, and the reward underwrites the risk. It motivates it. So on the one hand, we have an economic argument. But on the other hand, we have not just a justification for profit, but a justification for the profit system. That it has something to do with motivating action in uncertain times, and there's a sense of dynamism and newness that's sort of an engine that is creative and necessary and socially beneficial. But Knight wasn't quite satisfied with this. So he continued to kind of chew over the problem, and he actually went right to the heart of it with an essay called The Ethics of Competition. And so in this essay, he wonders to his reader about the, quote, standards of value implicit in the laissez-faire or individualistic social philosophy. And he also notes that he's worried about what he calls the, quote, progressive increase of inequality. And he's responding here to the socialist context in the 1920s. So he's recognizing that inequality is a social problem, and he's kind of chewing it over. How do we think about it in terms of capitalism? And he ends up developing what was one of his favorite metaphors. And it actually recurs in Friedman's thought, because Friedman is a student of Knight, which I'll get to. But his metaphor he likes is that economic life is a game. And he sort of extends this to society as a whole. Economic life is a game, but it's not all fun and games because, quote, everyone is compelled to play the economic game and to be judged. He then goes on to say, in a competitive game, it is absurd to speak of equality as an ideal. So this is a problem. Knight concludes, quote, there appears to be a deep-seated conflict between liberty and equality on one hand and efficiency on the other. So Knight is really wondering, what if we take this game as the source of ethics? If the game is a metaphor that's not just about economic activity, but really can be expanded to society as a whole, what if we say, these are where we get our ethics from? Well, then Knight concludes, we end up with an ethics of competition. And he sort of thinks about the ethics of competition, and he concludes that's really an ethics of power. And he's troubled by that. As he says, as he asks his reader, this is a very kind of discursive essay, are we, quote, willing to accept an ethics of power as a basis of our worldview? And he goes on to say that, most people have been taught, quote, not only that there is some sort of contrast between ethics and power, between right and might, but that the contrast is fundamental to the nature of morality. And when Knight says in various connections, we've been taught about this tension, he's really talking about religious morality. And he kind of gives the game away a few pages later when he comes to his other conclusion, the quote, Christian conception of goodness is the antithesis of competitive. So he's basically decided we have this ethical system here and we have this social system here, and I can't really bring them together. They're different and they clash. And then he's kind of like, okay, I'm done. Just kind of leaves the reader hanging. He doesn't figure out a way to bring them together. And what I would want you to notice is that in 1921, you can sort of get away with this discussion, this tension, and then, and Knight is a skeptical guy as well. This is sort of fits his persona and his temperament. But this is before World War II. This is before the Great Depression. This is before these questions really get sharp, really get urgent, and in a time when you can still kind of duck the ultimate conclusion. So I think Knight brings us into these questions and kind of sets them up for us, but he doesn't resolve them. And he doesn't really want to resolve them. He just kind of lays out these problems we have. So let me turn next to our other thinkers. And they come to us at a different moment in time. I'm here as part of the 75th anniversary celebration. Claremont College was founded in 1946, the moment of the post-war era. The United States is emerging into a new role in the world. And intellectuals are trying to make sense of what came before the Great Depression and World War II. And it's also at this moment that Ayn Rand is enjoying her first blush of fame in the aftermath of The Fountainhead, published in 1943. Now, one of Knight's arguments is that you really couldn't derive an ethics from capitalism. You really couldn't justify capitalism on its own terms. You'd have to go outside the system to find something. And the first time I read this essay, I was like, he hasn't met Ayn Rand. So she picks up these questions in a really interesting way. She finds a way around Knight's conundrum by deciding that capitalist ethics can be justified from within by pointing to the individual and by centering the individual in her moral system. So just like Frank Knight, Rand saw that there was a clash between Christian ethics and capitalist ethics, but unlike him, she didn't duck. She decided to make that the sort of centerpiece of her work and of her thought. So who was Ayn Rand? She was born as Elisa Rosenbaum in 1905 in Petrograd, Russia. There she is on the far left with her two sisters. She was in a prosperous middle-class Jewish family that lived in St. Petersburg. And she was living there when she was age 12 when the Russian Revolution swept through the country. She lived just off the main thoroughfare. She saw the soldiers come in. And then, not too long after, the soldiers came to the door of her father's chemistry shop and seized it in the name of the revolution and put a seal upon the door. It was now state property. So this became the defining moment of her life. She had seen, in the name of the common good, the seizure of her father's life work. And so not only did Ayn Rand reject the revolution, she rejected what she saw as the ideals that had justified and supported that revolution, humanitarian ideals, discussion of the common good, which she thought dangerously masked sort of force and power. That they hadn't just said, we're taking it because we want to take it. They're saying, we're taking it because it's the right thing to do. So she thought, if you can say that, there's something really wrong with how we think about what's right and what's wrong. So Ayn Rand wanted to go further. She wanted to go down to the root of the ethical system, and she was not afraid to call it and to challenge it as being fundamentally rooted in Christianity and Christian morals. As she wrote in her diary, Christianity is the best kindergarten of communism. So she thought that Christian ideas about turning the other cheek, about being selfless, had been sort of developed into the communist creed that the collective was more important than the individual. So she has this sort of set of intuitions and recognitions, but she's young. She hasn't fully developed her thoughts. And her main thought at this point in her life is, I have to get out of Russia. I have to go to the United States. So that's what she does. Here she is in the 1930s at her typewriter. It's not true she was named after her typewriter. I know that's been out there as a sort of a faux fun fact. But she came to the United States as Elisa Rosenbaum and pretty quickly changed herself into Ayn Rand. She had been experimenting with sort of stage names in Russia and trying to figure out which one she liked the best. And Ayn Rand appears to be kind of a combination of some of her birth name and her nickname, and then names that she thought would work well. What's really interesting is this is like the ultimate American recreation. Because if you look at the name Ayn Rand, you don't know if it's a woman or a man. And she regularly got letters addressing her as Mr. Rand. You also don't know that she is of Jewish heritage. So she's kind of erased some of her social qualities and kind of self-created herself as this new person, Ayn Rand. So the first place she goes is Hollywood. And Rand was actually obsessed with the movies. That was her first love, movies. In Russia, she had watched something like 200 movies and taken notes on all of them. So when she came to the United States, she wanted to go to Hollywood to work in the movie industry. And it's like one of these things, she just has this amazing life story where she gets to Hollywood, she's looking around, and the famous director Cecil B. DeMille like drives by. And she's kind of staring at him, and he's like, why are you looking at me? And she says, I just got here from Russia. And he's like, get in. You know, he knows a good story when he hears it. So he pops her into the car, they drive all around, and at the end of it, he offers her a job. Now, it was a very entry-level job, but like I said, she had a notebook with 200 film analyses. So she pretty much convinces him to get the same job here, and pretty soon she's reading studios for the DeMille script. She's basically trained herself up in this, reading scripts for the studio rather, so that she's trained herself up to say what's good and what's not, and then she's writing her own scripts. She has some little success here and there. She sells a play, she sells a movie, and she really, though, hits the jackpot with The Fountainhead, published in 1943. A book, and also, as you can see, a highly romanticized and Hollywoodized version of the book is then made into a movie. And this is, you know, Gary Cooper is a major star at the time. This is a real hit and a real breakthrough. How many here have read The Fountainhead, by the way? Okay, good, a smattering. I feel like it's getting smaller each decade, you know, as she sort of passes into myth. There's always the Fountainhead movie waiting for you. It's a little shorter if you don't have all that time. And then there's the great book, Goddess of the Market, that takes you through all her work, and it's much shorter. I'm not Russian. I didn't write a 900-page book. Okay, so this book really makes Rand's career. You know, it's a celebration of individual creativity and integrity. It's really a metaphor for Rand's own struggle for artistic recognition and artistic independence. So the architect Howard Rourke, played here by Gary Cooper, you know, stays true to himself through professional trials and tribulations. He won't compromise his designs. And, you know, it's on the one hand this story of this powerful individual. But the Fountainhead also made her into an icon on the political right. And it comes at a really interesting moment, and sort of here's why. So she's writing this book, and she's got kind of the plot and the story, and she wants to celebrate the individual, and she becomes, as she's planning out the book and writing it, she becomes ever more worried about the Roosevelt administration and ever more convinced that there's communist infiltration or sympathy in that administration. And so she actually stops writing the book, and she volunteers for the presidential campaign of Wendell Willkie. So she's like out on the street, she's arguing with people in New York, she's up on a soapbox, she's having the time of her life. Willkie loses, and then she goes back to the novel, and now it shifts from being just kind of a sort of psychological parable to much more of a political work. And she's putting in like Harold Lasky is a British socialist, Gertrude Stein is in there, people of her day that would be recognizable. She's kind of coding them as fictional characters. And so when you read the book, it has a bit of a hybrid character. It has this kind of the hero's journey on the one hand, and then it has, you know, the dangers, the political dangers that are lying in wait on the other hand. So those who are politically inclined read it and get it right away. And they say, this is an anti-Roosevelt book. This is an anti-collectivist book. There's a new star on the scene. There's a new intellectual who can help us develop the political case against Roosevelt and against the New Deal order. So she's sort of the belle of the ball for a few years, but pretty quickly, she kind of runs into the Knightian conundrum because the conservatives she's socializing with aren't interested in creating a new justification for capitalism in moral terms. They might say it's the American way to have free markets, or you know, we'll have more prosperity that way, or talk about the negatives of government, but they're not going to the root of things, and they're not sort of changing the way they think about what's right and what's wrong. So Rand basically decides she's got to do it, and she ends up stepping away from the sort of organized circles of conservatives she had known and writing up her own set of ideas, which she calls the Objectivist Philosophy. Let me see, I think I have a slide here of, it will end up being published in her second novel, Atlas Shrugged, which comes out in 1957. So here is really where her philosophy comes out in the fore. Now, it's still a novel. The plot, in some ways, recapitulates what her father went through in Russia after his business was expropriated. He decided he would no longer really work at all or make any effort, and he sort of sunk into depression. And Rand interpreted this as a strike, that he had sort of removed his, his energy and his drive from a corrupt system. So in Atlas Shrugged, she imagines what happens if the sort of leading business titans of the day, so let's imagine, I don't know, it's Elon Musk and Tim Cook, and they all disappear, and enough of you and your regulation and your meddling and criticizing, I can't handle it anymore. In Rand's case, it's, more industrial industries, factories, steel, railroads, and slowly society starts to collapse. So it's a dystopian sort of scientific or science fiction type novel. And at its core, though, is this moral system that she calls objectivism. So she's trying to show that selfishness, that working for your own interests, your own economic self-interests, is really the fundamental moral good. And so on the one hand, the talents of these individuals are needed for society, but that's not really the point. Really, the point is the grandeur and the singularity of the individual. And she then brings it down to an argument against altruism, that asking individuals to sacrifice for each other sort of impinges upon or distracts from the recognition that the individual itself, him or herself, should be the standard of value. So this is a complicated thing to explain, so I'm going to let Ayn Rand do it herself. She was asked at a press conference for Atlas Shrugged, right? They're trying to figure out, this is a sales team. How do I sell this 1,200-page book? And so someone challenged her, can you explain objectivism in 10 words or less? And she said, I can do it standing on one foot, right? Metaphysics, objective reality, epistemology, reason, ethics, self-interest, politics, capitalism. So she ends up weaving in a justification for capitalism as the only system that allows the individual to prosper. Now, her ideas end up kind of feeding into, well, let me say a little more on that. So basically, this ethic of selfishness concludes in supporting the political system of capitalism. So it's an ethical system that's sort of, it's fully compatible. We've erased that tension between profit-making or self-interest is somehow non-ethical, and now that itself, the profit motive, has become the sort of foundation of a new morality. And it's important because it supports the individual in their free movement throughout the world. And then it ends up in a politics as well of extremely limited government. Intervention in the government, even taxes, was wrong in her system. There's a limited amount that the government can do. It can extract a fee for enforcing contracts. It can have some taxation for national defense, but taxation for redistribution or for support of the basic functions of government is taking away from the individual's own wealth or own effort to serve the greater good. Looks to her like where she started in Soviet Russia. So Rand comes up with a workaround that there doesn't need to be a clash between ethics and capitalism. All you have to do is rework ethics entirely and kind of flip around what was considered to a virtue of vice and the other way. Now, it's also true that Rand, in an earlier phase in her life, was reading a lot of Friedrich Nietzsche. This might be echoing for some of you who've read his philosophy. So she's very, very influenced by him. But the real, one of the differences she would say, if we got her up here, she'd say, but I'm a rationalist. I'm interested in the rational mind. And Nietzsche's kind of, he falls into mysticism. That would be her critique. And that he also didn't architect it out into a full system. He made the critique of Christian morality, but he didn't say what comes next. She's the one who wants to say what comes next. Now, Rand was a controversial figure on the right. She was also a popular figure. So here's a series of billboards that was put up. It's a reference, again, to the plot line of Atlas Shrugged. Among the strikers that go remove their talents from the world is the mysterious John Galt. And so this phrase, who is John Galt, is a leitmotif throughout the novel. So these were billboards throughout the South, and I was like, oh, this is so interesting. I wonder where they came from. Well, they were put up by a young man named Ted Turner, whose father owned a billboard company. And I guess they didn't sell this particular billboard, so he put up John Galt. And Ted Turner goes on to found Turner Broadcasting, CNN, all of this. So he's an example of an early Rand devotee. But so for all the libertarians or the business leaders who liked Rand, she was very controversial among other conservatives. Particularly Christian conservatives could not abide her atheism. Because this whole system, as she said, is sort of an anti-Christianity, and she's very clear that she believes in the rational thinking mind. It's materialist, it's not spiritual, and it's focused on this world. There's not another dimension, there's not a deity, there's not an other world. So many Christians not only didn't like her atheism, they detected a sort of ethic of power underneath her thought. She was subject to a famous attack by Whittaker Chambers in the pages of National Review. And he basically said, this is a totalitarian system. Now let me see. And National Review constantly came back to Rand. This is later. So the Chambers Review was supposed to be like the last word on Rand, but people kept talking about her. So here, this is 1967. She's really kind of at the peak of her fame among the libertarian movement. And so National Review, the kind of flagship journal of conservatism, is mocking the movement to canonize Ayn Rand, as her rendered as Saint Ayn. But it's not just her opponents who detected this ethics of power beneath her thought. So when she published Atlas Shrugged, she got a fan letter from the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. And they actually got along pretty well for a while. That's another story, but here's what Ludwig von Mises wrote to her. Quote, "You have the courage to tell the masses what no politician told them. You are inferior, and all the improvements in your conditions, which you simply take for granted, you owe to the effort of men who are better than you." And this is a fan letter. So it's not a great slogan for a political movement, right? Obey the men who are better than you. So there, this ethic of power that Knight had been troubled by, that Rand thinks she's gotten around, is still kind of there, and people are still seeing it, and they're objecting to it. And nonetheless, her influence continued on. Another admirer was Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan. Here he is when he was sworn in as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And he's invited, his mom is the one that President Ford is hugging, and Ayn Rand, to come witness his moment of professional triumph. So, and Greenspan remained very loyal to Rand until the end of her life. Might have been the only person she didn't have a falling out with, because she was pretty impressed by all that he had accomplished. So there are some tensions. There's enough of a resolution that people like Greenspan can like her, that she can become an icon of libertarianism, but there's still that tension that Mises detects, that Whittaker Chambers detects, that maybe we need that tension between capitalist ethics and social ethics. Maybe it's hard to reconcile without ending up in a place you don't really want to be. Okay, so Atlas Shrugged comes out in 1957. And is right around the time that Milton Friedman, another icon of libertarianism, is dealing with essentially the same question. And he'll come to a resolution that's slightly different than Ayn Rand. So let me turn now to Milton Friedman. He was a little bit younger than Rand. He was born in 1913 in New York, and he grew up in Rahway, New Jersey. And his family was part of a wave. His parents were immigrants. So it was part of a wave of Jewish immigrants that came to the United States in the last decades of the 19th century, first decades in the 20th century. Now, most of these immigrants arrived and landed in New York or Chicago and sort of stayed where they landed. And so this sort of main plot line of American Jewish history is an urban story. So Friedman's family is very unique in that they moved to this small town. And so Friedman has sort of a unique childhood in terms of that larger immigrant wave. So he can do things like, oops, I missed that last slide, join the Boy Scouts. So here's young Milton Friedman. This is him right here in a Boy Scout troop in Rahway, New Jersey. And the defining event for Friedman, if the defining event for Rand is the Russian Revolution, for Friedman it's the Great Depression. So here's a picture of a bank run in the 1930s. And he finished college during the Great Depression and entered graduate school as it was just unfolding. This great decade of political and economic stability. The Great Depression caused unemployment up to 25% and deep poverty and suffering. There was an agricultural crisis. There was a crisis in the cities. There was crisis across the world, the rise of extremist politics in Asia, in Europe, and all of this would persist for longer than a decade. And across the world, liberal democracy itself was under siege, on the right from fascism, on the left from communism. And both of these movements claimed that liberal democracy itself was too weak to cope with the social and economic challenges of the 1930s, of capitalism at that moment. That you needed a strong state to bring social order, or you needed a strong state to bring about a more egalitarian distribution of wealth. So this turned out to be a really critical decade for intellectuals who called themselves classical liberals, like Frank Knight. So Knight starts his critique of socialism in the 1920s. In the 1930s, it's even more needed. And this is when Friedman and Knight meet as Friedman becomes his student at the University of Chicago. So there's a pretty clear transference of Knight's views on representative government, minimal interference in markets, or the price system to Friedman. And Friedman takes these ideas as his own, but he's also worried. He doesn't want to just repeat what's been said in the past, because he, like Knight, can see that social democracy, fascism, and communism are real challenges to classical liberalism or liberal democracy. So there's a real quest for figuring out how can these ideas be reformulated? How can they be changed to fit a modern era? How can they be rescued? So here's Friedman with his wife Rose. He actually worked for the New Deal in the 1930s. There were very few jobs for a trained economist. So he went to DC and he did a lot of studies on consumption and figuring out how to develop some of these relief programs that were underway. So Friedman, incidentally, at this point, he was not, someone was asking me, like, what are misconceptions about Friedman? And one misconception might be like, oh, he's for limited government, so we have an economic catastrophe, so nothing should be done. It's actually not the case. At the University of Chicago, there was a great sense of urgency. This is a crisis. We need to do something. We need to do more. And Friedman was very much on board with that. He didn't like that he felt eventually the emergency sort of went on forever. But there was a very robust series of reforms being discussed at Chicago, and actually a lot of the 1935 Banking Act was very influenced by Chicago economists who really wanted to come up with a fix for this and supported relief spending as well. And then Friedman got his own version of relief spending by getting a job actually in the Labor Department, a couple different agencies. So over time, Friedman then eventually transitions into his academic work. And the Great Depression, though, continues its legacy. He is very focused on money and monetary theory, and he eventually becomes famous for predicting inflation in the 1970s. But he started off focused on deflation, and he explains the tragedy of the Great Depression in terms of deflation, a loss in the value of the currency that then shut down economic activity. And he'll write this out in A Monetary History of the United States, published in the mid-60s. So he's concerned in his academic work with money, but he also has this larger question inherited from the 1930s. How do we think about capitalism? How do we defend it? How do we explain it? And he'll become really famous for these instead. He comes when he is on the cover of Time. In part, it's because he's an economist. In part, because he's cultivated this public profile as a very specific intellectual. And so he'll become famous for books like Capitalism and Freedom, Free to Choose, and columns in Newsweek, which is one of the major magazines at the time. Okay, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me come back to the 1950s, this kind of moment of Atlas Shrugged, when he's starting to put his thoughts and ideas together. And I'm going to talk about a series of summer conferences he goes to, where he's kind of lecturing to a group and discussion, Q&A, a little like every day of the week, so a little more intense in this type of event. And this becomes a seedbed for Capitalism and Freedom, which will be published later in 1962. So this is kind of where he's working it out. So just like Knight, and in fact because he inherits so much of Knight's thinking, he's concerned about inequality. And he's aware that the game creates unequal outcomes. And so Friedman kind of handles this in two ways. One way is to just expand his view to look globally and historically, and to conclude that, considered over time, capitalism actually raises the standard of living. And it actually reduces inequality between classes. So he looks at Western Europe and the United States, and then he compares it to, quote, a status society like India or a backward country like Egypt. And what he's thinking here of societies that are more hierarchical, where there's not mobility between classes, where it's hard to start new businesses, find new jobs, and saying, if they were capitalists, they actually would probably be less inequality. People wouldn't be stuck in their social station for life. Likewise, he looks within the United States and other capitalist societies and argues, quote, economic progress achieved in the capitalist societies has by and large meant a drastic diminution of equality, end quote. So this was actually really true in 1950s America. Friedman's looking around himself at what economists now call the Great Compression when wages and wealth across the distribution really compressed. There was much less distance between the most wealthy and the very poor as there is today. So Friedman's statement reflected what he saw around him. And in some ways, it was an answer to the question about inequality. It said, it's not really meaningful, there's another side to that yes, capitalism generates inequality, but it also can remove it. Nonetheless, he does still wrestle with this question. He does recognize that unequal outcomes sort of are part of the game. As Knight said, equality is folly to talk about in a competitive game. So what would you do? What would you do in a system where people could choose different activities and goals and had different outcomes? And so thinking about it, Friedman concluded the, quote, capitalist ethic was, quote, payment according to product. Like you get what you produce and that's it. And if that's the capitalist ethic, and paraphrasing Friedman here, you really wouldn't care about anything. You wouldn't have a reason to care about inequality. You couldn't justify any form of charity or government action. But Friedman, it turns out, was sort of a nice guy. He did worry about inequality. He did worry about poverty. He was not an anarchist. He didn't want to do away with the government altogether. In fact, he pressed for what we would call today a universal basic income. This was one of the first ideas, or he was one of the first thinkers to really talk about this idea in the modern American context and really put it on the map in the 1960s and 1970s when it was like a very, very popular policy idea. Then it kind of went away, and now it's come back. So he was definitely thinking very actively about this question and these problems. But as he thinks about this capitalist ethic, as he calls it, payment for product, right? That's the capitalist ethic. He decides he cannot, quote, justify either accepting or rejecting this ethic or to justify any alternative principle. So just like Knight, he's stuck. He can't accept the capitalist ethic, but he can't figure out why. And so it's almost like an intuition or even like an aesthetic choice, like he's sensing there's an ethic of power there that he's not comfortable with. It's almost like he read Mises' letter and was like, no, this is not what I want to endorse. And so he ultimately decides that the capitalist ethic must be regarded, quote, as a corollary of some other principles such as freedom. So here's the resolution that he comes up with. If Ayn Rand comes up with individualism, he comes up with freedom. Freedom is the touchstone, and you've got to not justify things in terms of capitalism, but in terms of freedom of the individual. As he puts it a few years later when he's feeling like he's really got it, he calls himself a liberal at many times, so don't be thrown off by that. He says, quote, the new liberal takes freedom of the individual as his ultimate goal in judging social arrangements. Now, Friedman is very hands-off on what the actual ethic that the individual follows. He's going to let that be worked out in another field, but he's going to say his own arguments, his own philosophy is that freedom is a lodestar, freedom is a touchstone. And he didn't really show a granular depiction of freedom in action as Rand tried to do. Doesn't really answer the question we might ask, freedom for what? And that would be dissatisfying to other thinkers over time. But in the 1960s, this was very resonant. So here's Capitalism and Freedom. It comes out in 1962. And it's one of a host of these books. You can stick them in your back pocket, and they all talk about the individual sort of fighting against the corrupt system. And so Atlas Shrugged is one of them. Capitalism and Freedom is one of them. The Catcher in the Rye is one of them. There's a whole host. It's kind of a stream in American culture. And it's important to note that this language was also taken up on the political left. So we think about movements like civil rights, feminism, gay rights. These are liberationist movements that also talk in terms of freedom. So it's important to note this language is kind of pervasive across the left and the right. It's sort of a cultural force field. And it becomes a larger keyword for the conservative movement. And it's much easier to talk about freedom than to talk in Randian terms about the evil of altruism or to promote selfishness. Freedom works much better as a sort of cohesive core ideal. And so freedom, as Freeman calls it, the, quote, rare and delicate plant, becomes a place where conservatives of many different persuasions, be they kind of Randian objectivists, Christian conservatives, Friedman, free market types, can kind of find this as a center that they can focus around. Now, Friedman's ideas still actually resonate with us today. He went on in 1976 to win the Nobel Prize. Here he is receiving the medal. And then just recently, there's been kind of an uptick in discussion of his ideas. This is a recent New York Times cover that is referring to an essay of his they published in 1971, kind of asking people to reflect on these ideas 50 years later. What do they mean? When he was running for president, Joe Biden said to a journalist, Milton Friedman's not running the show anymore, sort of referencing him as a touchstone for a whole set of ideas that are he wants to overcome or move beyond. So, okay, what can I say to kind of sum up on this question? You know, Rand and Friedman offer some powerful justifications for capitalism. They're complementary, they're not identical. You know, Rand really works in terms of the individual as a moral value that has intrinsic sanctity and sacredness almost, although she doesn't use those terms. And Friedman, you know, argues more in terms of freedom as an economic and political system. Now, they've both overcome the Knightian uncertainty of can capitalism be justified and said, yes, they're sure that it can. And this is almost the most important historic shift of all. Not the particular way they do it, but that they have such confidence that capitalism is a moral system, is an ethical system, or is something you can defend wholeheartedly. Now, there's still some problems left in these resolutions. One is a problem of race or of a multiracial democracy. Both Rand and Friedman lived through a time of tremendous change. They were witness to the civil rights movement in their day, and both of them had trouble connecting their ideas of freedom and individualism to this movement. And today, it's sort of hard to understand why neither was particularly prejudiced, certainly not more so than many white Americans who did accept the civil rights movement or support it. Rand, for her part, saw it as a movement of the left and was just immediately suspicious and could never really shake that suspicion and could never really get comfortable with some of the claims of civil rights leaders. She did believe the Southern laws enforcing segregation were immoral, and she did tell readers of her newsletter and in speeches, she did emphasize that. Friedman tended to minimize the impact and durability of racial discrimination. He tended to believe, ever the optimist, that capitalism would solve this problem. And he really worried more about the expansion of the federal government. This led him to oppose the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It seems, in retrospect, he modified his position somewhat, but in the moment, he was a powerful voice against civil rights. So the freedom that he promoted doesn't always lead where we think it would. It has some things left out. And the question of race, I think, relates to the problem of democracy and what it does in their thought, where it functions. We talked about the challenge of liberal democracy, the challenge to capitalist democracy. They had a lot to say about capitalism, not so much to say about democracy. And it's interesting, for these very political novels, Rand really didn't talk about democracy at all. As one of her critics, a friendly critic in the 60s pointed out, there's no elections in Atlas Shrugged. You know, and he thought this was the anarchist Roy Childs. He was like, this is really a problem because you come into the libertarian political movement and you haven't really thought about, you don't have a vision of the sort of push and pull of politics and parties and compromise. You have a very political, ideological worldview, but it's not mapping up with the sort of political institutions of the country. Now, Friedman talked about economic freedom, which he tended to emphasize over political freedom. Now, over time, this shifted. We can talk more about it. And I'm not saying that he set them against each other, but what he focused on in the most of his career was talking about economic freedom. Towards the end of his career, he starts saying, political freedom is much more important than I thought, and let me, here's some of the relationships that I think are important. But he tended to really take democracy for granted. He grew up in the United States. He just sort of thought he didn't see it as something in danger or something that he needed to particularly explore. So I think it's important that we find a thin discussion of democracy in these foundational thinkers. I think it's important because it sends us back to Knight's question of power. So democratic processes are ways to resolve questions of power. What happens when claims of freedom clash? The institutions of representative government ideally adjudicate these claims and support a framework of rights that bounds democratic processes. So these tensions, these mechanisms are not given sufficient examination in either Rand or Friedman. It's because they're so abstract. And this abstraction is powerful. It makes their ideas still interesting to us today. It lends a sort of universality to their thinking, but it also means they're missing something. And I think that can be fertile because as we engage with their thought, we find ample opportunities to question, to build, to come up with our own resolution of these things. And I also think this lacuna, this absence of thinking about democracy is really particularly relevant in our historic moment. At the start I said I was an intellectual historian. I think about ideas in their context and how they respond to their time. I swear I came up with this talk a long time ago. But it's nonetheless striking as I was getting ready to come here, I realized all of these thinkers formed their ideas in the context of Russian power. And the larger challenge to capitalist democracy, which Russian communism in its day represented. You have Frank Knight looking to the Bolshevik Revolution, its challenge to capitalism. You have Ayn Rand, a refugee from that very revolution. I have come from Russia with a message, she told her literary agent. And Friedman himself, shaped by the Cold War themes of freedom and believing that capitalist markets supported political freedom, and feeling so vindicated by the ultimate collapse of the Soviet system in 1989. For all of these thinkers, Russia was a foil. It was what they defined themselves against. They were thinking in terms of economics. Today, we must grapple with Russia not as an economic rival, but in terms of its authoritarian political system. Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman are a good place to start. Even if they do not give us a textured account of democracy, they remind us what is at stake, the uniqueness of the individual, that rare and delicate plant called freedom. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to take questions or talk more.
Thank you, Professor Burns. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the evening. If you have a question, we ask that you line up behind either of these two microphones. When you come up to the mic, take a moment and just introduce yourself, your name, your year, your major. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for coming. I'm Trevor. I'm a sophomore majoring in PPE. I wanted to ask about Ayn Rand's view on love. It's kind of a surprising thing to hear someone say love is a selfish emotion. And particularly the quote from the Fountainhead, I could die for you, but I couldn't and wouldn't live for you. I was wondering if you can explain how someone rationally would be able to die for someone but not live for them if they love them. And also just more broadly about how love is a selfish emotion.
Yeah, but it's such an interesting question. I think that what she was getting at, it's almost, okay, so here's another part of Ayn Rand that you might not know. She's also the fountainhead of a lot of the self-esteem movement in the United States. And she fell in love with one of her students, and she had an affair with him, and when it ended, he went to California and became part of the sort of human potential self-esteem movement. So the reason I'm saying this, one, there's a whole love story there we could get into, but what she was trying to say, so I think that movement parses some of this quote. She was trying to say, you have to love yourself first, right? And you'll hear this in, wellness circles, right? You have to love yourself first so that you're a complete person when you come to the other person. Otherwise, you need them. You have a neediness and a dependency that's not good for the relationship. So she's really talking in philosophical terms, but I think it has a resonance in how, social workers and clinical psychologists talk about love. Rand herself was someone who treasured rationality, but was actually really a romantic, swept by very strong emotions. So I don't think she ever fully rationalized that. But I've definitely heard of people who have that read at their weddings, that's a quote that they find very, very, very meaningful. So I would say even if she didn't have the love life we would all want to emulate, there can still be some insight there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I'm Steve, a sophomore at CMC studying PPE. I guess my question is about Friedman's contemporary John Rawls and his theory of justice. Mm-hmm. So I guess the book was published around the same time, and I wonder, in the book there's this critique on inequality in terms of wealth, in which that the accumulation of inequality will essentially lead to further domination behaviors that divest people of their political and social rights, which in turn they're put some limits to their positive, or I guess positive liberty. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if Friedman tries to address that in his writings.
Okay, so I think your question is about kind of Rawls' idea that inequality would sort of accumulate over generations, or advantage would accumulate over generations. I think Friedman would actually disagree, because he would say, by looking at, say, the history of corporations in the United States, that there's churn and there's turnover, and that if you don't have interference in a market process, eventually companies will lose the competitive game and sort of fall out of it. So I think if you gave him data that showed class mobility had slowed down, maybe he would change his mind on that. He really believed that the freer you had economic entry and exit, and the less regulation, price support, whatever barriers to entry there would be sort of churn and turnover and opportunities for people who weren't wealthy to succeed. He basically thought what happens is people succeed in a marketplace, and then they build a barrier around the marketplace. They say you need a license, you need a higher degree, you need something else to get in this marketplace because we want to hold on to all the wealth that's here. And if you knock that away, you would have more people coming in. So I think he would say that generational process is supported by some of these barriers. I'm not saying that's necessarily true. It could definitely be true in some cases. It doesn't necessarily need to be true about the whole society.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. I'm Giovanni. I'm a freshman here at CMC. And while listening to your talk, there's just something that I'm grappling with, and I wanted to get your perspective on. I think I'm still in the night camp in terms of capitalism and inequality, and trying to find the balance between them. I guess the main dilemma that I'm facing right now is, what is more fair to the individual, in terms of either on one camp you have kind of taking someone's, I guess, rights or freedoms, at least a few of them, away for the sake of others, and kind of treating people as a means to an end, versus the complete opposite camp, in which you're just sacrificing, or at least allowing, inequality to persist for the sake of freedom of the individual, and a laissez-faire capitalism. So it's how do you find the balance between individual freedoms versus the fairness for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the perennial question, right? And so one thing that Friedman focused on was trying to create what he called the conditions of competition. So that would be rule of law, clear transparency, lack of corruption, education. So by the end of his life, he basically was the problem is we don't have an equal education system, so people aren't able to compete on fair terms. So we need to set up everything we can do. What he didn't want to do was interfere with the game once it started, or what another teacher of his called the heart of the contract, the ability of people to sort of freely enter contracts. So he would say, the more it's possible for people to leave and exit jobs, the better the jobs offered will be. So, I mean, I think he basically felt like you actually have less inequality in a capitalist system than in any other system. And so he's very clear at the end of his life. He's like, look, tell me any other country in the world that's raised the standard of living of everybody better than capitalist countries, advanced capitalist countries. We may be in a different phase now where sort of wealth growth has accelerated so much that the gaps are more than he would be comfortable with. But in his day, he would step back to the bigger picture and be like, I think this is the best you can do compared to other systems. And if you try to create more equality, you might lose some of what you gain by having a more free system. Does that make sense?
Yes. So
okay, I'm not sure I can resolve that question for you, but it's
no,
it's a constant tension, right?
It made sense.
Yeah.
That the system is good as is. It just needs more of a better foundation for people to get a chance to become part of that system.
I think that's a lot of what by the end of his life, he left all his money to a foundation. So he believed that public education needed to be improved through competition, so there needed to be funding for private schools or vouchers or things like that. And so that was his belief that would make it better. The reason education had declined was because there wasn't enough competition, and so in the public system, there was no incentive to improve. But yeah, so then that would create the possibility for people to make the choices they wanted to make in their life. The other piece about inequality that's really important is the way he would set up the game is by putting a floor under it with a universal basic income. And that would just be income that would not have anything to do with your particular status in society. So he hated farm price supports. He's like, why should we support farmers as opposed to barbers, right? We should just support people whose income falls beneath a certain level. And he said, we can figure out how much you need to consume, and then we can figure out how much that costs, and then we can give people that money. And then they can do with it what they want. And there's not a work requirement. They don't have to be married. And in his day, this was super revolutionary. And it still is today. People today, a lot of, welfare is supposed to be punitive because it's supposed to teach you a lesson. And Friedman was a total libertarian on that. He was like, nobody needs a lesson, they just need the money, So I think if you put in all the systems, you might get to a place that's better than we are today. I don't know for sure, but he did think about that. So that's a misconception that he never sort of thought about inequality or poverty. He just feared that if you did too much regulation and too much taxation, you would slow the system down and not ultimately have enough momentum to raise everyone's standard of living.
Right. Thank you.
My name is Rukmini. I'm a sophomore at CMC, a philosophy, politics, and economics major. I think my question is about how Milton and Friedman all claim to predicate their ideas on the sense of the individual to pursue their means or have freedom, but in capitalist societies with a lack of regulation that allows for a rampant accumulation of wealth and property, which then can obstruct other people's capacity to then do the same, which then inadvertently limits their freedom and stifles their abilities as individuals. So then how would they reconcile that reality of capitalism with the ideal that it's predicated on?
Yeah, how would you break up concentrations of wealth or power that were unequal? I mean, Friedman's idea was always, the market will do it, And so I think you have to question, will it do it in all cases, right? And if you've tried that and it doesn't work, what else could happen? So he kind of went back and forth on antitrust. He earlier in his career, he supported antitrust, and he thought there were definitely some industries where it made sense to have either antitrust enforcement or public goods, public provision. And in the end, he basically decided, he looked at statistics about business formation and how monopolized different industries were, and said, I don't think this is actually a problem. It's only a problem because he thought the only barriers to entry were created by the state, not created by other things. So that if you were totally free to raise capital and the business offered a profit opportunity, someone else would raise capital, come in, and be competitive. So I mean, I think you have to make up your own mind if that works in all circumstances. He had a really, he'd had one idea and then it went it was kind of globalized to everything, And so I think that's a very powerful way to look at the world, but it may not be complete, and you have to, figure out, does that always work in all circumstances?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm a first year at Claremont, McKenna. So my question is, how does Milton Friedman reconcile the idea of having to level the playing field with a negative income tax, as well as providing sufficient education, significant education to people, with the idea of a limited government and a limited government role in distributing these services?
So what he would say is basically we already have a guaranteed minimum income in this country. It's just in a million different places. It's food stamps and family support, and somebody who needs it has to wend their way through this whole bureaucracy, and let's just rebate it to them through their tax return, because then we won't have to have all that bureaucracy. So he basically thought there was a way to do it more efficiently is part of it. And then, sorry, the other part of your question was about education?
Yeah. So how does he propose providing quality education without expanding the government's role in it?
So what he would do is he would say the government can provide a voucher or a stipend to parents who can then take it in the marketplace where they want to go. And actually, this is what the government did with the GI Bill. So if you were a returning veteran, you got a tuition stipend, and you could take it to flight training school to become a pilot, or Claremont, McKenna, that great new college in California, right? You could take it wherever you wanted. And so he thought we should do that on the elementary level because then there would be, like, schools would spring up to try to win those government dollars. He was not ready to abolish public education. He thought, like, maybe we could get there, but we can't get there right now. So in the meantime, let's put, like, private market forces within the public education realm. So ideally, that would reduce bureaucracies overall and maybe save some money.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank
Sorry.
you so much. You're fine. Thank you so much for your talk. My name's Annie Decky. I'm a senior. And basically, I've understood that, like, Ayn Rand's viewpoint was very much shaped by growing up in communist Russia and having to flee that state. And I guess today, seeing Russia act with similar aggression, but no longer in the name of communism, now with a system of state capitalism. Do you think if Ayn Rand had grown up in the Russia of today, that we would have experienced a totally different Ayn Rand? And do you think her her blind spot for state institutions kind of blinded her to the fact that, like, communism may not have been at the root of everything that she was against in seeing Russia act the way she did growing up?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, like, yeah, that, maybe there's patterns in, Russia's historic behavior that takes the guise of communism in one century and not in others. If she'd grown up in a capitalist-oriented Russia, I think you would have had these stirring novels about the individual creators. I don't know if they would have had such a political freight. They may have been read more by people of one political persuasion than the other, but it really was that mission and that sense that, so the other piece of the picture is when she wrote her first novel, which I can recommend. It's called We the Living. It's about her family sort of struggle in Soviet Russia, and so it's a sort of a white Russian family and how they suffer during the revolution. It's much more naturalistic. It's like a realistic novel to some degree. So she went to sell it, and she couldn't find a publisher in 1930s New York because everyone said, this isn't true. Like, Russia's doing great. There is no starvation in Russia. There are no, and so that's when she felt like, that's when she really got the mission. Like, if I don't say it, no one's gonna know. But on the other hand, she didn't really like Russian culture just in general. She considered it like mystical and dark and depressing. She loved American culture because she thought it was like optimistic and upbeat and kind of all the superficial things we might think about American culture, she actually really, really appreciated. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. My name is Wolfgang. Thank you so much again for the talk tonight.
Yeah.
Recently, I've been reading about Herman Daly and steady state economics and all the ecological economists who started thinking about ways in which growth could be conceptualized as uneconomic or certain forms of growth. I can guess where Rand probably settled on this, but did either of these thinkers have any conception that any kind of growth was bad, or was growth always good for them?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think Friedman would say growth is always good, but what he wanted was consistency more than anything. So he would be worried in there was, if you got too focused on sort of spiking economic growth, you would push the economy ahead of where it should be, and then it would fall back, and that would be disruptive. So for instance, his idea on you should have 2% inflation, that would be, that was like the inflation target that we used to have. And then also the growth in the money supply. He almost didn't care where it was as long as it was steady. So it was predictability. But I think he would have thought that it wasn't so much growthism, it's just you have a growing population. And so from his view, you needed to be expanding the currency available just to reflect that. I don't remember too much of what he says about growth, but I think in general he would be in favor of it because he would think it would kind of, the rising tide would lift all boats. So I'm not super familiar with the school you're talking about. What I would say is that he did tend to think about, he worried about, he didn't assume that capitalism was necessarily always a stable system. Like, he knew that there could be crises, and there often were. He tended to blame them all on the monetary system, but he nonetheless was aware of that. So you don't hear this kind of like the business cycles fiction type stuff. Yeah.
Okay, got it. I meant like as in like crises in the environment or like ecology?
Oh, did he think about ecology? So Rand definitely hated environmentalists. I can tell you that for sure. Because she was very she was like sort of pro like the conquest of nature. That was like human rationality was the conquest of nature. And she thought that environmentalists, she called them the new primitives. They want to like take us back to an era that we've like worked so hard to overcome. I don't recall Friedman saying really anything about environmentalism. I mean, he didn't comment on every single issue of his day, so yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Professor. My name is David. I'm a sophomore here, and I study computer science. You mentioned in your intro that one of the side effects of capitalism has historically been environmental degradation. And I was wondering whether you see an environmental degradation as an inherent side effect of capitalism, or whether you have any faith that capitalism can be tweaked to make the environment prosper with commerce as civilization supposedly does.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of embedded polluting energy systems that it's going to take time to disentangle from, but I think you see environmentalism when people are have a lot of wealth. Then they start to care about the environment, and then they start to think long term. So if you believe that capitalism is most likely to generate wealth, that's going to give people the mental ability to start thinking long term and worrying about the environment, then you can put them in accord. Also, if you think that the best way to handle some of these problems is like, through taxation or incentives, then I think it can work too. You can say, well, what if we tried to harness all the people's energy to like make profit, make good for themselves, make new things, and instead we price that in. I think there's a movement for that now. Let's price carbon. Let's try to incentivize new energy technologies. So I think it can, and I said this to the table. It's easy to just say, and I did it today, capitalism. Like it's one thing, and we all kind of know what it is, but there's many different types of capitalisms. So we're talking in some ways about trying to harness human ingenuity and drive and human motivation, and how do we do that? And we found that reward for effort is pretty motivating, but again, there's also problems when it's just reward for effort. So I would say, if you really care about the environment, you want as much prosperity as possible so that people can consider it a luxury, right? Because the biggest polluters right now are the countries that have less political freedom and less economic freedom because they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to raise the standard of living for everyone. So I don't think it has to be totally in conflict.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great. Now, as we wrap up the program, I just want to take a moment to thank you, Professor Burns, so much for joining us this evening. In recognition and in gratitude of you joining us, we'd like to present you with a commemorative Claremont McKenna 75th coin.
Oh my goodness,
now, please join me in
Milton Friedman would approve. Is it legal tender?
Please join me in thanking Professor Burns.